Mr. Ray.
It's a Boy Scout motto.
I think happier we is the Girl Scouts motto. They have more fun. We're more edgy. We're on to Chapter 5.
Chapter 5, members, and also I'd remind you to pull out, among all the other papers you're going to be referring to frequently, the open issues list that the staff prepared for us and as part of our agenda binder. There's one open item issue and language change that staff has flagged, apart from all the other issues that are going on. Okay. So, Mr. Ray, you want to introduce this discussion?
Yeah. For those who are following along with the script,
speak into the microphone, please. Well, he's trying simultaneously to turn to his files next to him, which are voluminous, and talk.
Yeah, for those who are reading along with us in the plan, we're Chapter 5 about describing the unique the Council's strategies for protecting the unique values of the Delta as an evolving place starts on page 165 of the plan. And this chapter has important narrative in the introductory sections that describe the values that make the Delta a unique place. And it also includes a narrative that explains what the Council means when it uses the term an evolving place. And the plan goes on to make recommendations, propose two policies and 19 recommendations that would designate the Delta as a special place, that would talk about planning to protect the Delta's lands and communities, maintaining agriculture, and encouraging recreation and tourism, and sustaining a vital Delta economy. One thing we've recognized as we've reviewed comments about the plan and had this chance to discuss it with several local government agencies is that our drafting of the policy DPP1, the basic policy about deciding new development wisely, wasn't clear about the areas where we wanted to encourage the location of urban facilities like residential, commercial, and industrial uses. Some people read that to not include recognition on our part of urban and urbanizing areas that are in the unincorporated areas already identified in their general plans and with LAFCO approved spheres of influence. And so we wanted to add language to that chapter's first policy here, DPP1, and this is language that's described in the open issues spreadsheet on page 5 of that, so that we would make it clear that the new urban development, including residential, commercial, and industrial uses, must be limited to urban and urbanizing areas. And we use that term in the map, and so it's easy then to figure out what are the areas we're talking about. Urban and urbanizing areas that city and county general plans designate for development in cities, their spheres of influence, and areas within Contra Costa County's voter-approved urban limit line and the Mountain House General Plan community boundary. Those are both areas that we had previously acknowledged could be appropriate for those uses.
Let me just make a comment. In the last day or so, we got a letter from the principal planner of the Contra Costa County Water Agency discussing these exact same issues, and it was unclear to me in reading the letter that it's clear they want to have recognition of the voter-approved urban limit line, but they also have options on considering Bethel Island, which is treated uniquely in the Delta Plan, and they're not. They say they don't know why it's treated uniquely. I want to make sure. I believe I understand your position on Bethel Island and the problems of Bethel Island, but I read the Contra Costa letter as perhaps suggesting that we should treat Bethel Island as one entity, a legacy community, regardless of its intense development and its unique problems in assessing itself to pay for flood protection, unwillingness to assess itself to pay for flood protection.
Bethel is a little bit of an unusual circumstance because it's It's actually in the Delta Protection Commission statute, I believe, that the legacy communities are identified by name, and one of the areas that is identified is Bethel Island. It's unlike any of the other legacy communities, which are much more rural villages with pretty clearly defined boundaries. And in Bethel Island, of course, there's quite a bit of development strung out along the levees, often several miles from what you might think of as being the core of the old community there. There are resorts that are out on the north side of the island, and then this large second home, essentially, or water-oriented development that's been dredged and filled, but not yet built. And they have a number of problems. I mean, yeah, the levees right now, the island's not even at HMP, so should there be a disaster, flood, they wouldn't even be eligible for emergency assistance. The ingress and egress to the island is limited to a single narrow road, so it's very difficult to provide any sort of emergency response out there. And in a flood, it could be a real serious
and
problem.
The voters rejected an assessment proposal, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, to provide their cost share of improvements.
And there's still studies underway with the Corps of Engineers to identify ways that they might be able to improve those levees. There certainly would be a cost share required, and that would require their improvement. And then the final piece is there are barely any urban services out there, so water and wastewater would need to be extended. So anyway, our point is that, yeah, Bethel Island is an anomaly. We shouldn't treat it like we do the other areas that are within urban limit lines or like the other legacy communities. We're trying to depict a portion of the community that is already fully committed to development, and map that in a way so that our policies make sense. And one of the differences is in how we in Contra Costa think about it is how that term legacy community works with the policies in our plan. And Contra Costa has a way that works for them, given the policies in their general plan, which do say you can't do anything out on the whole island other than a single family home on an existing lot. And so we're trying to come up with policies that would lead us to the same outcome. It requires we describe things a little differently than they're depicted in Contra Costa's map. So I think we can make a little adjustment in the boundary for the legacy community that we had proposed to you previously that respects some of Contra Costa's issues.
Refresh my memory. Is Bethel Island inside the urban limit line adopted by the voters? Or
yeah, the
outside?
entire island is
the entire island.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we'll need to, as we clean this language up and deal with the other pieces of Contra Costa's letter, we'll need to address that to make sure we're not inadvertently kind of green lighting development on the island.
Done. Press that blue button, I think.
On now? Okay. Dan, just on the letter, as you were just addressing and responding to the chair, then they've listed two alternatives. One would be to put an entirety of Bethel, and the other one is to actually have some other areas that may either be suited for recreational development potentially, and I guess a little bit of commercial recreation. So you'll take a look at those two, and then when you're back to us.
Yeah, I think what our policies already, of course, would allow visitor serving recreational uses, commercial recreational uses outside urban areas or legacy communities. So in terms of trying to accommodate those activities, our plan would already do that. So it already takes care of that portion of Contra Costa's concern. Okay. There are some commercial areas that are immediately west of the legacy community boundary that we identified that we ought to be including within the area that we identify. Those are existing built-up areas. Contra Costa has also suggested that an area, it's not insubstantial, it's maybe not quite a quarter, maybe more like a sixth of the island, that they had planned for residential development, but is only partly developed as sort of a rural estates, kind of hobby farm size parcels, 5-10 acres, that also should be included within the boundaries of the legacy community. That could allow that could indicate the commission, the council thinks that substantial additional development there is appropriate. And again, our point of view is that until the flood control issues and the service issues get addressed, those areas should be outside the area where we're identifying as the legacy community and signaling that additional development is appropriate.
This is the biggest single urbanized area within certainly the statutory delta primary areas that I know about.
Secondary.
Yeah, it's actually in
I
the
understand it's in
secondary zone.
secondary zone, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry. What I meant, in the areas that are closest to the water, in the areas that are likely subject to high risks of flooding, sea level rise, and so on. This is the most intensely developed currently. Is it fair to say that if somebody wandered in and said, I want to take a piece of land in a different county that's similarly situated and throw 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 people on top of it, there might be some problems with that?
Well, I would contrast how Contra Costa has dealt with this with how Sacramento County has dealt with it, because in Sacramento, the boundaries of the boundaries of the kind of village planning they've done for legacy communities are pretty tightly constrained around the more built-up part of the community, and the kind of what I would call rural residential or kind of ag ranchette properties are kind of outside the boundaries that they've shown for those village communities. In Contra Costa, the entire island is sort of shown within the urban limit line, including this area that is kind of this 5 to 10 acre, 2.5 acre kind of rural residential ag general property that's just outside the currently built up area. So I think that's the issue that we're trying to struggle with, is we try to make the county system and our system fit together in a way that works for us and works for them. Does that help?
Yeah, it really doesn't, because Contra Costa had its own problems, and I was representing that county in the legislature for 10 years right after they adopted their urban limit line. They were attempting to constrain growth to protect large swatches of land in East County, Contra Costa, and the two examples of questionable development they wouldn't have approved under other circumstances were Bethel Island, which was an old one, and Discovery Bay, which is a relatively recent one. And there were lawsuits that resulted, that occurred after the urban limit line was adopted, challenging the urban limit line. There have been modifications and adjustments over time. It's so different from all the other communities, we might say legacy communities, that it's hard to say that this one is like Isleton. I mean, it's not like Isleton. It's not like Cortland. It's just by itself. This is largely a retirement community, and it's pretty densely populated. I'm not opposed to the language that's in the Delta Plan now, but I don't understand the implications of making the entire island a legacy town when all of it's within their urban growth potential.
We wouldn't recommend that. The council do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
I think maybe it would help just to, since we're on this topic right now, if you have the county's letter in front of you, you can see that it includes a map that they've provided suggesting an alternate boundary for the legacy community. Which
And
would
if you
include
don't
these-
have the county's letter, you can turn to Appendix K9, page 11 in Appendix K, and you can actually see a map of Bethel Island, and that may help everybody be more oriented to.
Yeah, it's page 11 of Appendix K.
Mike?
This is a discussion that's also come to the Delta Protection Commission. And one of the things that is focused on, I think, is the term legacy communities. And what does that confer other than identifying a fact that the community is there, they have some historical significance. I think there's a feeling of some of the residents on Bethel Island that if they're designated a legacy community, there are other benefits that get accrued to them that are not.
State money to pay for the levee repairs. I got a call from a lady who was on the local district after the voters had rejected it, and she said, gee, we're searching for state money to pay. Our voters have just turned down their self-assessment. And I said, and the argument for the state to do that is, and she said, we need the protection.
But my point is, I think we've used legacy communities to identify, but I think it's being interpreted by others that there is a package of benefits or a basket of benefits that may be available if you get that designation. It's one of the reasons that they're striving to try to achieve that designation.
And, of course, the only benefit we provide in the Delta Plan that's part of that basket is relief from policies that otherwise might require a 200-year level of flood protection for residential development, or expose projects that were being constructed to greater scrutiny through the covered action process. So if you look at Appendix K and page 11, you can see the area that we've suggested within Bethel Island that ought to be, that we were recommending be depicted as the legacy community. And you can see the much larger area that Contra Costa's general plan proposes for single-family residential development. That's that area in yellow, as well as the commercial areas that are proposed for recreation. What the county is suggesting in their letter is that if we don't want to designate the whole island as the legacy community, we should designate the entire area that they had planned for residential development. And instead, as I pointed out, the areas at the eastern end of the island, those residential areas that are outside of the area we propose in Appendix K as being part of the legacy community, those areas have the opportunity for substantial land division under the policies of the Delta Plan, should we include them within the legacy community boundaries. So that's why we're not suggesting it. It would make sense, though, if you look at Contra Costa's letter, if you have it, they identify some commercial areas that are just immediately east of the area we propose as the legacy community, as well as immediately north of it, adjacent to the golf course, that those areas ought to be included within the boundaries of the legacy community. I think that probably makes some kind of sense. We'll be thinking about it over the next week. But that's one of the issues we'll bring back to you a couple of weeks from now.
Don.
Yeah, just would add, and Mike can weigh in here too, that in the review of primary zone, for inclusion in primary zone, that in the study we did on, the commission did on that, this was, Bethel Island was recommended. Again, that has not been taken up. Obviously, that requires legislation. But
for the entire island to be in the primary zone?
That's right, and that was asked for specifically by the residents, and that report, which was forwarded on to the legislature, was done so by the commission without any recommendation. And so there's been no action on any of the report regarding any
by the Protection Commission, DPC.
Or by the legislature.
Yeah, right.
But I just heard something about legacy communities and 200-year flood protection. The statute for 200-year flood protection sets the threshold. Urbanizing areas or 10,000 urban areas of 10,000 people or more, or urbanizing areas that will reach 10,000. None of the legacy communities are even approaching that threshold. So, a relief of 200-year flood protection at this point doesn't seem to be. I don't understand the significance of that.
It's because the policies of the Delta Plan would require 200-year protection for major subdivisions in rural areas. They could be obtained through floodproofing. Wouldn't require levies necessarily.
What's the relationship of the Delta Plan and existing statute?
Well, it's an area. This would be an area where the council believes it has some concurrent jurisdiction in terms of its ability to set standards.
Yeah, we're really jumping into the Chapter 7 and the flood policy, but I'll just tell you, the concern that I have is I do not wish to leave the implication that the Delta Plan believes the state of California automatically has a financial liability to pay for all or a lion's share of flood protection cost for further development on Bethel Island. And I know you're right, Mr. Machado, there are people down there who prefer that. And so the designation of the entire island as a legacy community, I'm not opposed theoretically to it. And I think I'm in favor of what Don said, which is the inclusion in the primary zone. But I don't want to leave the impression that the decision has been taken by the council that, oh yeah, state should pay for all of that flood protection. Because if you had to pick a site that is flood threatened and likely to continue to be so, Bethel Island would be pretty close to the first example you picked.
I didn't mean to imply that should be the role of the state. But I'd like to revisit the situation with respect to changes to the primary and secondary zone. The major discussion that took place was what happens when you open that up again, because as we all remember, back in 1992 when they established the original Delta Protection Act, that was a political decision in terms of dividing the legal delta into the primary and secondary zone. And I think it was the commissioner's feelings that making a recommendation to change it would not necessarily constrain the proposal of change to be what was in the report, and therefore they didn't want to risk opening up the whole issue of discussion. And that was the basis for the report, which included the recommendation of Bethel Island that was submitted to the legislature without any position from the commission.
Randy.
Just to conclude, though, in this case, the policy that we're proposing to change now, it's our intention that that not change the status of Bethel Island, and we'll make sure that we go through and look at the fine print of the text. We haven't done that.
Okay.
If
Randy.
we have any suggestions about that, we'll bring it back for the next year.
I'm confused. I'm looking at the map on an Appendix K, and the area on Bethel Island that is outlined as the legacy community area, the last time I checked, there aren't very many houses there. It's all developed roadways and building sites. But the last time I checked, was there 10 houses there? Not even that.
The Delta Coves area is entirely undeveloped.
Okay, and that's what's designated on this map as a legacy community area.
That's a lot of what's designated, that's right.
It doesn't make any sense to
Well,
me. It's almost a misuse of the term legacy.
Well, I'm not the guy who said Bethel Island was a legacy community. I'm trying to make sense of what we've been given, and this is the situation is quite anomalous. The Delta Cove subdivision, which was divided probably 20 years ago, I believe, the issue of its development has gone entirely all the way through federal court, and the courts have ruled that at least the county has no ability to stand in the way of its completed development. It's recently come out of bankruptcy. Real estate investors have spent several $1 million to acquire the property. And the county is fully expecting that they will be approaching the community services districts that serve that area or the city of Oakley to extend services, and that within the foreseeable future there may be, if the market returns, they may have the opportunity to start seeing some development out there. And so we're trying to, again, as a plan, looking ahead, we're trying to anticipate what is likely to be the densely developed residential commercial area of Bethel Island, and it seems that Delta Cove will likely be part of that.
It just seems to me ludicrous to exempt them from a protection level that we've all agreed upon is important for an urban area.
In this case, that's actually, because that's all done through fill, that's the best flood-proofed area on the whole island, and they're probably already at the level of protection that we would require of anybody else.
Okay, well then that's my confusion. I thought I heard you say that we wanted to exempt them from the 200-year flood protection requirements or recommendation.
Our flood policies in Chapter 7 say they restate in the text the requirement that's in state law that urban areas have a 200-year level of protection.
The Machado Act,
Yes.
so-called. Yes.
And they say that residential development in rural areas, outside of urban and urbanizing areas or the legacy communities, should have a 200-year protection, whether it's provided either through flood proofing or through levees. And that, to me, makes sense in part because we're trying to anticipate climate change and rising seas. So maybe 100 years, what might make sense, for an area that's further up the valley, won't be affected by the rising sea levels. Maybe we want to have the 200-year level to, a little extra protection down in the delta. And so that's how those policies work. We really don't say, hey, here's what, I don't believe, I'll go back and look in a second, but I don't believe we ever say, here's what you have to have in legacy communities. I think what we say is, here's what you have to have if you're going to do residential development beyond the boundaries of the urban and urbanizing areas or the legacy communities. It's a policy that's designed to, both provide some flexibility for rehabilitation structures in legacy communities, where it's often impossible in existing structures to provide 100-year protection. Yeah. But with that change to DPP 1, we think this chapter is largely ready to go. And with that, I would just turn it over.
So, and we will be bringing back next week in 2 weeks, specific language changes because we just got these comments and we will come back with specific boundary changes. But conceptually, I don't see the policy changing. We don't want to exempt we don't want to call the entire island a legacy community. We do want to respect what's already in fact in place. And for us, being in place means the courts have already ruled and said this development can move forward. And so that's kind of what Dan's trying to do.
Well, excuse me. There'll be a time after we get through the panel where the public can talk.
So I don't know the details of how that will end up in terms of the specific recommendation, but that is the intent that we have.
Yeah, and again, what we're trying to do with the language change we're proposing in DPP 1 is just acknowledge that there are, not thinking of Bethel Island, but there are other urban and urbanizing areas that are planned for development within existing LAFCO approved spheres of influence in Contra Costa and in San Luis Obispo, San Joaquin County, and we want to make sure we're covering them with our policy.
One more question.
All right, let's go. I'm sorry, Don.
Yeah, just one follow-on question on the proposed staff change. I just want to be clear, and it's not an addition, but we said this policy does not cover commercial, recreational, visitors serving uses. I get that, but on the first part of that, where it says new urban development, including residential, commercial, and industrial uses, must be limited to urban and urbanizing areas, I want to get some clarification on this because I think it's a point where it may become contentious in the future. If we talk about for processing crops or facilities serving recreation, but some of those facilities for processing of crops, and whether they be trucking firms, firms that provide fertilizers and other farm products, certainly processing facilities, they do require industrial zones, at least in some communities. And so if, for example, someone wanted to come in and locate one of those facilities, it would require, not all of it's done with an ag zone with some sort of an additional entitlement. Then under this structure, that would be consistent, at least generally. I mean, there might be some other specifics to it.
Yeah, if you look, President Foley, the final sentence in the policy is that this policy does not cover commercial, recreation, or visitor serving uses or facilities for processing of local crops or that provide essential services to local farms.
Okay, so I took that sentence and put it back to the opening sentence, so where it says new urban development, and it has those zones, because it's one thing to have the use, but if the use falls into a category, or say a service station, you can either, there's not very many places to get, at least on the land side, to get fuel for vehicles. But if that required a commercial zoning in order to accomplish that, and it served, obviously, residents, it would serve farmers, it would serve the recreational users too. So that would be consistent?
Let's leave. Well, a gas station, I can leave aside for a minute.
Okay. All right. So we'll leave that aside for a second.
But yeah, if you wanted to locate a trucking facility to haul crops from farms to markets or processing facilities,
okay,
that would be entirely consistent with
even if it required a rezoning to accomplish that.
I think you would.
I know you have to look at the circumstances. So I'm trying to get some the general context here. Okay, but then for those types of uses that could serve the recreational aspects, commercial recreational, i.e. a gas station, those things, you have to look at that closer? Or that
I think if it was a resort, a recreational vehicle park, someone wants to have a bed and breakfast in the farmstead, other visitor serving, rural, visitor serving commercial recreation facilities, that would be allowed, consistent with that policy.
4-story hotel, 200 rooms, oriented toward recreation. East side of the bridge across from Rio Vista.
I think that if the local government were to could make findings that that action was consistent with this policy.
And what level of flood protection would be required for that development?
It would be required to meet the 100-year level of flood protection.
Yeah, I don't have as much problem with services to local farms as I do with the kind of open-ended recreational terminology here. That seems to say the Delta Plan, even in the primary zone, has nothing to do with recreational activities. A 2,000 boat marina proposed somewhere that may affect the water quality and other things it's okay it's at least excluded from consideration under the Delta Plan, as I read this language.
Well, we have identified those areas, for example, that are important for ecosystem restoration. The kind of action you propose would be inappropriate in that sort of location. But to the extent that...
Well, this policy, however, does not say that with the exception of floodplains and potential restoration areas, this activity is okay. Correct?
This policy would not control that sort of an activity. Really relieve it.
Yeah, so it means development on a floodplain might be okay if it met the definition of recreational visitor services or services to local farms.
They would need to comply with the floodproofing stuff, typical rural floodproofing standard. It would be imposed by the county, or that would be a 100-year flood protection.
I want to step in here. I think actually the policy that's in Reduced Risk Chapter 7, RRP2, I'm sorry for being so technical about this, would say if you went in to build a large-scale commercial development across the river from Rio Vista, because that's not part of the city limits, they would have to meet the 200-year level of protection.
The point I want to make here is, unless you clarify in the Delta Plan that how the provisions relate to each other, you simply leave the issue open, guaranteeing litigation, guaranteeing disputes that will ensnare us for years to come.
So in this case, I think the policy that says about development would allow it to move ahead. The policy with regard to flood restrictions would say if you're going to do that kind of development, you need to meet the higher standard.
Well,
the 200-year protection?
Actually,
yes.
Joe, we're talking about RRP2?
Yes.
See, that's written very clearly to control only rural residential development, 5 or more units. It wouldn't control a commercial recreational use.
Right.
Mr. Chair, but there are other things that are going to be in control of that. You've got local general plans. Certainly, that you're going to have to comport with the Delta Plan. So this issue certainly is pertinent there. The Land Use Resource Management Plan under the Commission's auspices that has to comport with the Delta Plan, and general plans have to comport with that. And then you've got other requirements that are coming down either from FEMA and or through the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that are going to drive all those considerations. And I guess, in fact, I don't think you've seen much of any new marina development in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
I mean, you can use a hypothetical, things can change, yes. I just don't, you haven't seen that, and certainly not in the primary zone.
I think, one of the things that this illustrates, and Chairman Ivanson brought up a good point, is there are many potentially risky activities that are not addressed in the Delta Plan and not controlled by its policies. That's one reason its recommendations and its policies are so sparse, because they focus on problems, not things that are being dealt with adequately in general by existing local government processes, by the Protection Commission, by the federal programs. We don't have any policies about the siting of marine terminals that are handling hazardous materials and oil and gas, even though those facilities are scattered along the Contra Costa shoreline within the Delta. We don't have any policies that preclude the destruction of wetlands, even though those are a key resource. We're relying on the existing programs that manage those two issues, for example. And in terms of the typical standard of flood protection for areas that are within the urban and urbanizing areas and within legacy communities, or that aren't rural residential subdivisions, we're generally relying on the existing programs, and we don't have policies in the plan that would control them.